All right, we're going to begin. Welcome to today's webinar. On the call today, you will see my colleague, Joe Folkman. We have with us a regional vice president and longtime colleague of ours, Tracy Consolini, who will manage the chat box for us. So if you have questions or requests, she will be the one responding to you. I begin today by telling you a story. A few years ago, our firm had a leadership conference, and we invited to speak at that conference a man named Kevin Wilde, who was the chief learning officer of General Mills. Before that, he'd been a highly respected executive at General Electric. And he came out and gave a presentation at this conference for us. A few days after that, I received a phone call from him, and it said, I've got a favor I'd like to ask of you, Jack. You know that presentation I gave? I'm going to do it again. I'd like one suggestion from you for what I can do to make that better. Luckily, I paid attention to his presentation. And interestingly enough, there was something that occurred to me at the time it was happening, that if he had done this, it would have made it, for me, a better presentation. So I passed that information on to him. He said, hey, thanks very much. That's exactly what I wanted. We exchanged a couple of more pleasantries, and we hung up. I sat there at my desk for a few seconds and thought to myself, now I know what's made you so successful. And so I would ask you to just ponder for a moment, what strikes you about this exchange? Now, because there's hundreds of people on this webinar call, I'm not going to try to elicit from you your observations and thoughts, but let me share with you a few that I've heard from past discussions. One of the things that strikes people is that he clearly was not fishing for a compliment. He didn't ask, how was my presentation? Or, no, he wanted something constructive. The second thing was that it was limited. He didn't ask for a list. He didn't ask for an overall appraisal of the presentation or the talk. He wanted one concrete suggestion to make it better. The third thing I think many people observe is that he communicated the message that people genuinely want to improve, and that this person wanted to improve. And the final thing I would observe was that, to my recollection, he did never use the word feedback. And so we'll talk about this a little bit more. There are some things I suspect that most of us on this call would agree on. First of all, that the term feedback has a lot of negative baggage wrapped around it. And that primarily is driven by the fact that for many people, the word means something that's wrong, or it has a corrective nature. There's something negative about this message. The third thing that I think can agree on is that when you interview employees and colleagues, they will invariably say that they want more of it. And yet we know that when a boss gives feedback to a subordinate, it does often trigger some emotions. And by the way, there's been interesting research done that the emotions aren't just on the recipient's part, but the bosses are likewise often uncomfortable and just generally troubled by the importance and the nature of this whole process. So I'd like to have us think for a moment about changing our assumptions. And changing our assumptions in this way, we first of all rethink about where feedback has to come from and who triggers it, who initiates it. And maybe an assumption that it's the boss's duty and that it's his or her responsibility, and that it always then generally flows downward. And that corrective feedback is the most valuable and most important. Those are all some assumptions that we'd like to kind of challenge today. And indeed, we're going to propose kind of a new behavior. And that behavior is that rather than relying on feedback being pushed, maybe we can rely more on feedback being something that is pulled. And so we would argue that if the objective of an organization is indeed to create a feedback-rich culture, this pull assumption would greatly increase the volume of feedback that occurs, which in turn, by the way, would increase the receptivity and the likelihood of it being implemented. And it would create a situation where the leaders in the organization now have the opportunity to kind of be the role models of this asking and responding kind of process. So we think that there's a way to make this feedback culture occur. And again, it can be focused on helping everyone to develop what they're good at, their strengths. And this practice rests upon the foundations of research on the value of people feeling that they are in control of the life around them. And finally, I would observe that what's powerful about the idea, I think, is that it puts the relationship between the giver and receiver of feedback as a transaction between two adults, rather than being a parent to a child and a downward process always. So let's go back for a moment and analyze the story of the CLO who asked for one suggestion. As you think about it, what made that practice work so well? As you think about it, what could have torpedoed that discussion? And I would observe that what could have torpedoed the discussion would have been if I had sensed that he was only fishing for compliments, or that he wanted me to give an overall appraisal of his effectiveness as a presenter or as an expert in the field of learning and development. And the third thing that would stand in the way is this idea that people's intentions are not, not really noble ones if their ideas trigger people's sense of insecurity. And we know that very often when people, what stands in the way of them asking questions is that they're afraid of hearing the answer. They're insecure about the answer that they might receive as a result. So we'd like to talk with you about some tactics that we believe can really encourage the process of asking for feedback. And clearly it's a new mindset. And it's a new mindset that's based on what we think is some hard evidence that good research supports the idea that when someone asks, it really triggers a number of consequences. And so, Joe, off we go.
Well, and Jack, you asked for it here. So I went and dug in the database, and we looked at our data on asking for feedback. And we have in our standard 360 assessment, one item that basically is around how frequently a person asks to receive feedback. And if you look at that one behavior and you kind of think, well, does that have much impact on a person's effectiveness? This habit of continually asking for feedback rather than waiting to be told. What you see here is the evidence. And in the graph here, you'll see that one item asks for feedback. And if you look at the first to the 9th percentile on the horizontal axis, and what we're measuring here is overall leadership effectiveness. We have 60 items about a leader's effectiveness, and this is the overall score on those 60 items. And you can see if you're really bad at asking, if you never ask for feedback, in fact, if you resist it, Your score is 16 out of 100, 16th. You're in 16th place out of 100. But if you're in the 90th to 100th percentile, your score is 87. Now, that is really amazing that one behavior has such a strong impact on how you're perceived as a leader. And you think about it, people are just waiting to get feedback, but those that ask are more effective. There must be some magic there, Jack.
Yeah,
There must be. You know, the other thing that we found is what's interesting is that those who ask were rated much better at giving feedback. That's interesting. I mean, you can see here that the effectiveness, we put it in quartiles this time, but we're measuring the vertical axis there is the effectiveness at giving honest feedback in a helpful way. And those who are bad at asking, you know, we're not very good at giving feedback. So they you know, bad. But those that ask frequently in the top quartile were rated in the 78th percentile on giving others feedback. So there's some real advantages to doing both well. We looked at some other behaviors that are going to benefit from asking for feedback. So those who asked for feedback dedicated more time and effort to developing others. They listened better. They looked for opportunities to recognize others. They were better at building self-esteem of others, giving credit to others when they performed well, giving feedback in a way that others accepted, and asking thoughtful, open-ended questions. So these things are all connected together, and we find, you know, again, this behavior of asking for feedback very powerful and having far-reaching positive effects.
Okay, what I'd now like to ask you all to do is thinking back to this example of this colleague of ours, Kevin Wilde, and his conversation with me. Think of examples in your career where others have asked you for suggestions. What consequence did that have? What was the outcome of that? Or if you personally have done that, where you asked someone else for their ideas, their information, their feedback for you, what were the consequences in that case? And what was your reaction to the outcome? And I would like to propose that there are three very powerful outcomes. And those three outcomes are, I propose that it changes the relationship between you and the person who asked. That the relationship is closer, it's more trusting, it's more valued. When Kevin Wilde called me and asked me this question, Kevin had worked for years with Joe and much longer relationship, and I'd not been close to him. But when he called and asked me that question, I felt differently about him. And I think he felt differently about me. The second thing that happened is I think it changes how people perceive you. That when this question and asking process takes place, that people say, oh, I see that this person really is eager to constantly improve. My observations of them are higher and more positive. And I think finally it produces just a bundle of wonderful outcomes and ideas that you can use in your relationships. Some ideas about how we can improve this process would be these. Let's fine tune the language that we use. We earlier observed that I don't remember Kevin ever using the term feedback. He was asking for some suggestions, for some advice, for an idea for improvement, for some refinement in how he was doing it. And I would propose to you who are considering doing this that you don't need to use the word feedback. There are other ways of saying it which get the same result, but without the emotional baggage that that surrounds this whole idea. So I would encourage you to kind of then think about an opportunity where you say, who do I know that I could ask this kind of a question to? And to take the time to create a script in your own mind for kind of how you'll go about asking that person, whether it's a boss, could be a colleague, could be somebody outside the organization, or it could be your partner or your spouse. But identify a specific situation where you might ask this kind of a question. Secondly, mentally rehearse that conversation. You know, years ago, I remember a pretty well-known psychologist who was talking about the importance of mental rehearsal. And I guess I was very shocked by this because I assumed that everybody mentally rehearsed conversations that they were about to have, until I learned that that's not true. Not everybody does. But I would strongly encourage you, if you're thinking about having this conversation, to mentally rehearse how you're going to say it. And when you hear yourself, even mentally say this, you often fine-tune your own language. And the final thing I would invite you to do is to then anticipate what could be a spectrum of responses. Could be some very effusive praise, but it also may be something that was something you didn't do, or something you could have done differently, or something that would be a little bit corrective. And kind of mentally rehearse, how will you handle that? What will you say? So that as you go into this conversation, you will have thought about what you want to accomplish. You will have rehearsed it till you're kind of comfortable with doing it. And finally, you will have anticipated what the responses might be. And again, so if we're going to create this culture of feedback, we think leaders can really set the example by asking their direct reports and their peers and their boss for ideas, for suggestions, for ways to improve. And if we want that to occur throughout the entire organization, we need to communicate to our entire frontline group that if indeed they want more feedback and want more information, the best way to get it is for them to ask for it. It'll all work much better. Now, maybe it's also worthwhile just injecting a little bit of caution. There was some interesting research done by a couple of psychologists who did a kind of a meta-analysis of feedback examples and practices and behaviors. And they found that indeed, about 38% of the cases that they studied did not have positive outcomes. Now, I personally believe that the ones that did not have positive outcomes were not ones where people had asked, were not ones where people had sought a specific, limited, focused suggestion. I suspect that they were much more the traditional boss giving some corrective message to their subordinate. But I think it's worth noting that not all feedback has positive consequences and positive outcomes. It depends very much on how well we do it.
Thanks, Jack. And oftentimes I rehearse, what I might say. And then when the person doesn't say the right things, I kind of think, you're supposed to say, boy, are you brilliant? That was a great question, but you didn't say it. Anyway, but no, those rehearsals really do help. So question, what kind of feedback do others want to receive? It's interesting. I was with a group several years ago, and I asked the question. I said, your boss has some really important feedback, and I think it'd be helpful for you. How many want to hear it? And every hand went up, right? I mean, it's like, okay, people want to hear feedback, and especially if it's important, it's going to. But if you think about it, do you want to hear that positive feedback? And yeah, well, that'd be good. But people are really curious if there's anything wrong. I mean, if you ask them that question. Now, we did an assessment where we studied this. We asked this question, uh, and the question was, the thing that would most help an employee to improve performance is being given specific constructive suggestions about how to improve, or being given regular recognition and praise. So we asked this to over 9,500 managers. And guess what? 82% of those people, and again, they said what people want is to be given specific, constructive suggestions for how to improve. And you think about it, if your boss had some specific constructive suggestions for what you could do and improve, you'd want to hear that. What's interesting is when you actually do hear it, that sometimes kind of goes south. And that's, the Kluger and Denisi article, which said, sometimes when you hear it, you say you want to hear it, but when you hear it, boy.
No, I think the key part, though, of this question was, the way the question was phrased was, what would most help employees to improve?
Yeah.
And it was to that question that managers were saying, well, yeah, I think being given specific constructive suggestions. It wasn't that they really wanted that more, but that's what would help them the most.
Okay, so that's good. So which approach to giving feedback do most leaders prefer? Now we've got a poll that's coming up. And so as you think about you as a manager or you as a person, what do you prefer to do? Do you prefer to give negative feedback, or do you feel it's your role or responsibility to give negative feedback, or to just give positive feedback? Positive or negative? Well, what do you think, Jack? Do most people think it's their job or their role, or they prefer to give negative?
Joe, this is, as you know, this is something that has always puzzled me, that I think that what we're going to see is that more say they prefer giving negative feedback. And yeah, let's see what this group thinks.
All right, so here's the results of that. No, the
Okay.
84%, they prefer to give positive feedback. It's much easier, right?
Yeah.
You don't have to get net, but there's this interesting thing that happens because people or managers feel responsible. So here's what we have. We did a study with 9,580 people. This assessment asks your preference for giving positive feedback or giving negative feedback. And so you could avoid it, you could be neutral, or you could give, right? And you have positive and negative feedback. So if you look at that, what we found that's really interesting, the two highest numbers here are not but the interesting numbers, was we found 37% of the managers actually avoided giving positive feedback. Jack, why would people avoid giving positive feedback?
I think they sometimes bosses think that if they give too much positive feedback, that the employee is automatically going to expect a raise,
Yeah.
or they're going to coast, or that they'll become, or be complacent.
Yeah.
So I think that may be why some would have that posture.
But the biggest number here is 63% had their strongest preference was to give negative feedback. So why do managers feel obligated or responsible to give negative feedback?
Yeah, and I think that there's been this assumption that my duty and responsibility as a boss is to give negative feedback. Maybe that first group of 9,500 was a particularly corrective bunch. And it's interesting that the people on our call today here, a much higher percentage of them really did prefer to give positive feedback.
Well, that's true, but we asked the questions a little bit differently, and
Yeah, yeah.
and I think if you think about it, uh, most managers they feel it's their responsibility to run a tight ship, and if anything's wrong, I need to tell people that
Yeah.
some things are done
Yeah.
wrong.
Yeah.
And it's a hard job, but I'm willing to do it.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, these preferences. So we looked at this data, and so we're going to ask another question. What percentage of those who prefer to give negative feedback assess themselves as effective at giving feedback? Would it be not as many, 25%, 50%, or 75%? And so, is there a correlation between the preference to give negative feedback and the extent to which you rate yourself as good at you're effective at giving feedback? So which do you think it is? 25, 50, 75? Let's see the data here.
Let's see the data. Yeah.
Well, yeah, 48% say, 75, 33% 50, and only 19% 25. So here's the question. We asked those people that did the survey. We asked them to rate themselves on this question. I would rate myself as highly effective at providing others with honest, straightforward feedback. Now, we divided people into 4 different groups. Those that avoid giving positive, avoid giving negative. So they had just avoided feedback, right? They don't want to give any feedback. And only 31% rated themselves as effective, right? If you avoid giving positive feedback, it gave negative feedback. 72% said they were effective at giving feedback. Isn't that interesting? So
Yeah.
if I'm willing to give negative feedback, if I have a preference for that, I tend to say I'm pretty good at giving effective feedback. Now, if you give positive but avoid negative, you can see that it goes way down. And those leaders, they said, I'm not so great at giving feedback. And again, if you gave both positive and negative, this was the highest number, 78%, which is interesting. So this is me rating myself on both, on my preference for giving positive and my effectiveness at giving positive.
Right.
So next, we're going to add another wrinkle. But before I do, I need to ask you this question. Would leaders who gave no feedback rate themselves more positively by others than those who gave only negative feedback? So if you just say, I don't give positive or negative, I avoid both, would not this is how you rate yourself, but how would other people rate you? Would they rate you as more positively or negatively? And so let's see what this comes out, this question. This is a hard question. So yeah, false. 66% said that that was false. That statement, leaders who only gave no negative feedback rated more positively by others than those who gave only negative feedback. So let's look at the data. Now, what we did here is we merged our self-assessment data with 360 data from others. So this is their direct reports and manager and peers rating them. And what we found is that if you avoided giving positive, avoided giving negative, on the question of, how well does this person, their effectiveness at giving honest feedback in a helpful way, they were at the 41st percentile if you avoid. But if you avoid giving positive and gave negative, they actually went down to the 36th percentile. So they were rated less positively by others at giving honest feedback. Those who got the highest score were those that gave positive and avoided negative. They were at the 53rd percentile, and those that gave both positive and negative, they were at the 52nd percentile. These are ratings from others, on average 13 raters. So it's interesting when we look at how others perceive how you are doing. When people rate themselves, they say, well, if I'm willing to give negative feedback, I rate myself high. And if I didn't, I rated myself low. But when we look at others, that changed a lot. And then when we look at overall effectiveness, what we see is that, again, leaders who avoided giving both positive and negative were at the 42nd percentile. Those who avoid giving positive but gave primarily negative feedback, their overall effectiveness rating went down to the 36th percentile. And those that give both positive and negative were at the 49th. And those that give positive but gives positive and gives negatives were at the 46th. So you can see that what's happening here is people that had a preference for giving more positive feedback were rated as more effective leaders overall and more effective at giving feedback. There's something about that giving positive feedback that really is magical.
All right. So the implications of what you've just seen, all this data, I guess maybe my summary would be that preference for giving negative feedback has some negative consequences. That team members feel judged, that they sense that leaders are only kind of looking for what's wrong. And it really, in general, has far worse consequences than most managers believe it does. On the contrary, the dangers of giving only corrective feedback we see here is damaging relationships, people ending up being in a negative mood during the rest of the day, which in turn reduces their effort. And someone has used the term an amygdala hijack, that when people receive corrective messages suddenly from their boss, it triggers an emotional center in our brain that just reacts instantaneously. It's not logical, it's not rational. It's just very, very knee-jerk kind of reaction. So if you've come away from what you've heard with, I need to think how I give more positive feedback, give it more frequently, give it in the right context, then you've heard the right message in our opinion. Maybe some of you are familiar with a man named John Gottman, who is a very highly respected marriage counselor and therapist. Done a lot of research, observed thousands of married couples, counted the number of positive and negative interactions that these couples had with one another, found that if a married couple had a 5 positive to 1 negative interaction, the probability that they would stay together was significantly higher. And he received lots of national attention a few years ago at his accuracy in predicting couples who would eventually end up in divorce. So we hope that you're coming away with a conclusion that the practice of having a preference for giving positive feedback really does pay dividends. Team members feel valued and appreciated. The consequences, that makes it possible for, on occasion, the manager or the colleague to give some corrective thoughts, to give some feedback that would be maybe considered negative. But if it's balanced in the context of having much higher doses of positive feedback, it goes down a lot better. And so higher ratings on feedback development and overall leadership are the consequence of having this general preference for giving positive feedback. You know, we sometimes think that we've discovered something brand new. Happened that I was reading a book by Marcus Aurelius, his book called Meditations. He was the Roman emperor back in, 160 to 180 BC. And he wrote in his musings about life, if any man is able to show me that I do not think or act right, I will gladly change, for I seek the truth by which no man was ever injured. But he is injured who abides in his error and ignorance. We think we've discovered new ideas and new thoughts. I want to conclude today's webinar with a kind of a personal story. The picture you see is of my granddaughter. And as you might surmise from the picture, she's studying to be a veterinarian. Happens that she's going to be a dermatological veterinarian, which I'd never heard of before in my life. Not long after I had this conversation with Kevin Wilde, she was visiting with me and she said, what advice would you give me? How would I have a more successful career? So I told her the story and I said to her, Liza, when you work with a professor, when you work with a veterinarian, when you work in a clinic with other colleagues, ask them for one idea that would make one thought, one suggestion that would make you a better intern, make you a better student, make you a better prospective veterinarian. And so she heeded that advice. She actually put it into practice. And she wrote me a letter a few weeks ago, and I'm going to just read to you just a couple of paragraphs. Your advice to ask for feedback truly changed my career trajectory. It's very uncommon for a fourth-year veterinary student to have a residency offer before completing their postgraduate internships. I'm the only student in the last 10 years at my institution to receive one. That is, in that fourth year of their formal schooling. For added context, following my dermatology externship, I asked the dermatologist to provide one thing I could improve upon before my next externship. I received great advice, and when I reached out again for feedback, she set up a series of interviews which resulted in my getting a residency. She says, I attribute 100% of my success to date from my following the advice that you gave me about asking people for their advice, suggestions, and overall feedback. So I would conclude that my contributions on today's webinar by saying, think about this, because bottom line, it really works. Joe, tell them about.
Boy, Jack, that is a great story, and your granddaughter is in weightlifting too. That's a big
yes, yeah.
So what's interesting about what we've talked about today, asking for feedback, it's one half of what we call coachability. And we have created a new product around coachability. The other half of coachability is taking action to change after you get the feedback. So it's asking and then taking the action. And what we'd like to suggest here is that you might want to look into this whole Coachability product. It is a great product. It's getting rave reviews, but it really helps people think about and open their awareness to asking for feedback and how you ask and what you do with it, and then taking action. And we have a great course, and I think that when people have gone through it, They've really loved it because it's got a self-assessment that goes along with it. And it's very exciting. It's not a 360 assessment. It's a self-assessment, but it gives people a sense for how open they are to coachability and their willingness, and it looks at their ability to kind of follow this process through. So what we'd like to offer you is the ability to either attend an online session. That's in June 25th. There's a live online session, or to host an in-person session in your organization. And we're offering a 50% off on these sessions here. And gosh, take advantage of this. This is a way to introduce something that is incredibly valuable. This one skill, as Jack talked about his granddaughter, that she learned so well, of asking for feedback. This is a great habit to develop. And I think as people get into it, they'll have that same experience. So either one of these, you're welcome. And of course, as with all our programs, we'd love your feedback on this session and what went well. We also have, as you do the survey that comes with it, there's a special offer, and you can raise your hand for that special offer. And in addition to that, we have 5 books that we're giving away on coachability. This is written by Kevin Wilde, and it's a wonderful book. Jack and I have both read it and learned a lot from it. And so you'll get a chance to read that book. Now, the link to take the survey, and it should come up automatically, is at the bottom of the screen there. And if it's not coming up, you can get in and do that survey. Listen, we've loved having you on board today. This is a critical behavior, asking for feedback, and that's what we're doing right now. How'd we do? We'd love some feedback. So tell us more. And thank you so much for attending this webinar today on a really easy practice that has an enormous benefit for everyone, asking for feedback. Thanks so much.